The Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow. A show for all who are on the journey to discover the truths about their identity, history, culture, politics, spirituality, and family relationships. This is a show for the Black Freedom Movement and the Black Power generation and the hip-hop generation, including Black Lives Matter and associate activists, all of whom are seeking change. Dr. Oba Tashaka and his guests are dropping knowledge and insight from his successful organizing, research, writings, and innovative thoughts, the best of which have piped into God's mind to lift you up higher and higher. To the bosses, OGs, rappers, influencers, and those looking to evolve from the constraints of misinformation and miseducation to build a foundation for personal growth, love, and mental freedom. Check out the wisdom of the OR. Yeah, that's the original revolutionary, Oba T, who inspired 1 million black men with his rousing speech at the Million Man March, and who continues to fight, write, and speak the truth. Dr. Oba Tashaka is one of the deepest deep thinkers in the world today. A quote by Dr. Asa Hilliard. Dr. Oba Tashaka, then Bill Bradley, was the best leader organizer in the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE. An endorsement from Dr. George Wiley, Associate Director of National CORE and the best organizer blacks produced in the 1970s as the organizer of the National Welfare Rights Organization. The Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow.
Greetings to the viewers of the Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. How's everybody doing? I want to remind people to hit the subscribers button if you're new to the show, and to also note, if you like the show, hit the like button, and this will help us to draw more viewers to the show. Last week, we solved the donation problem that comes under, you can see the banner that's under this show, Cash App, $ Pan-African Pub. So if you type into that, you'll be able to make a donation to the show. And a couple of people did last week. I'll note them next week. And I'm appreciative. And I know people have tried to before, but this thing wasn't working. But we had a little young computer genius that just piped in, and she just, ooh. So this was figured out by the younger generation. So I want to introduce our distinguished guest, Professor Manu Ampim. And you know, he's been on the show a number of times dealing with his research in African history. He's a primary researcher and writer and a professor. But he's also the foremost authority on Dr. Martin Luther King in the world. And he's established it by the quality of his work. He's the only scholar to have accurately defined King as a revolutionary in the written form. I know that a lot of activists know this, but a lot do not. So welcome, Brother Manu. How you doing?
Thank you, Brother Tashaka. I'm doing great, you know, holding down the fort and winning every battle.
This is an intellectual warrior, you know what I mean? He's a hard-working man. I don't know who works harder, him or me, because I'm doing this every day, so is he. But he's been doing more on the continent over a period of time in his intellectual work and observing political conditions, and then taking people to the continent, to Kemet, and everything else. This is a brother who is really close to my heart because he's not only a serious scholar, but he's a community scholar. He's constantly interacting with the community, sharing what he's got. The last time we were together was at Pan-African People's Organization's Kwanzaa, where he spoke, and where, you know, we had a beautiful program organized by Brother Ustadi Kadiri, one of the leaders of the Pan-African People's Organization. So he's always out sharing his information and putting out. He's had a recent book that he can talk about. He's talked about on this show before on African history that's outstanding in content and in beauty. And this is stuff that comes out of his pocket. He and I both do our own publishing. That way you don't have somebody in between filtering your stuff. Y'all know what I'm talking about? So this is a real honor. And since this is the month of Dr. Martin Luther King's birthday, and we've had a number of shows on King, one focused exclusively on the revolutionary Martin Luther King, and this is Manu Ampim's breakthrough. His master's thesis was on this. He went to FBI headquarters and researched it. It's very detailed, and the stuff that you get on King is just plain bull. It's a rehash of what we know and full of propaganda, and it freezes him in time, and you never see the radicalness at any stage in his history. And you get a Pulitzer Prize when you write books like that. So Manu knocks these scholars out in his master's dissertation, which I know sooner or later is going to come out in book form. So we've covered the revolutionary Martin Luther King. We went into his assassination, and then we went into some other areas of his contribution. And so today, this show is focused on the topic, Dr. Martin Luther King's opposition to the Vietnam War and his support for African independence movements. And we're going to start with what most people don't know a lot about, which is King's connection to Africa. And I recall you, Manu, in one of our shows talking about how thick his African file is. And I think as engaged as Malcolm was, I don't think Malcolm had the amount of contacts that King had, because it was over a longer period, and it was going back to the late 50s, and we're going to go into that in a minute. And so, you know, he had that opportunity. Malcolm had very important contacts, but this is often not understood about King. You understand? So a lot of people don't know about King, and in part because what's been written about him has left it out. So you're going to get it brought in. So, you know, the first thing I wanted to do, and this is going to surprise viewers because you don't expect this approach. I'm a strategist, so I always like to come. I used to pitch baseball. I had a curve and a fastball. The curve is the surprise ball. The fastball is just designed to overpower you. I had a real intimidate, raise my leg high and throw hard, and I go after your knuckles. So you'd have to back off the plate if you wanted to swing fine. And as a strategist, I always like to come from an angle. But this angle, it just comes out naturally because it's in King's development. So let's first talk about how King's pan-Africanism influenced his view of the Black freedom movement. And in part of this comes after his success in Montgomery, the Montgomery bus boycott, but that's 55, 56. And then using this also, let's look at it through the lens, particularly of King's involvement in Ghana's independence and interaction with the African independence movements in Africa. So you want to start that off, Manu?
Yeah, that's always a great place to start because King has been completely misrepresented. I argue he's the most misrepresented figure in U.S. history. So what we think we know about King has little to do with the objective record. And one of the things that was amazing as I combed through the FBI archives and the archives at the Muger collection at Boston or the King collection in Atlanta and went through all of the records and his speeches, his press conferences, his interviews, his books, the FBI secret criminal files on King. And I was as well as the records of his organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And one thing that was very clear is that Dr. King embraced the the African liberation struggle across the continent without hesitation or reservation. And so one of his early presentation or speeches was writings, actually, birth of a new age. So back in 58, Dr. King began to 56, and then 57 and 58 he embraced Africa. So when Ghana became independent from the Gold Coast and was changed to Ghana, and Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah, through some colleagues and contacts, King was invited along with his wife to Ghana, and King was there at the Independence Day celebration of Ghana. And somebody can say, yeah, but Ghana kind of negotiated their independence. They really didn't go through armed struggle. Yeah, but even if you look at that, if you look at Dr. King, he made no distinction between the independence of Ghana, the independence of Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia, Kenya. And King embraced all of these revolutionary movements because he said that our struggle in the U.S. is the same as our brothers on the African continent, brothers and sisters. He said that they were dealing with the same thing, quote unquote, white supremacy and the contempt for life, unquote. That's how he put it. So for him, this was the same struggle. And King said that we had to be concerned about these struggles on the continent because they were the same as what was happening in the U.S. And so this is why, as a minister who was concerned, as he would phrase it, the least of these, the barefoot and shirtless people of the world, this is why he embraced these revolutionary movements and never gave any hesitation as to how they were becoming independent. So back in the 50s, King began to develop direct independent relationships with revolutionaries that were literally fighting armed struggles in the field. So this is why his file was so large. These were not just newspaper clippings, but really revolutionaries, like in the Mau Mau uprising against the vicious British in Kenya. Dr. King had relationships with revolutionaries in Kenya, in Zimbabwe, who were fighting liberation struggles. One might say, well, why didn't he say something about them putting down their arms? No, Dr. King was very clear that even though these were the same struggles, those of us in the U.S. fighting for freedom and liberation and those on the African continent, he said the differences were this. He said on the African continent, it was the colonizer being kicked out by the indigenous colonized people, and that these were winnable struggles. So for King, it was a political calculation. That is, that these were winnable struggles, these were just struggles, and these were quite legitimate to kick out the oppressor. And so King had no problem whatsoever. This is why with all of his sermons, all of his essays, all of his speeches, all of the interviews and records with his organization, never once does he condemn the method that they were using. King had no problem with people rising up with arms to free themselves. And so this is why he, without hesitation or reservation, embraced armed liberation movements. And you can see all of the letters, all of the contacts with those revolutionaries such as Tom Mboya and so many others. But what's also interesting is King, beyond his organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which he led, but he also helped to form the American Negro Leadership Conference on Africa. And the American Negro Leadership Conference on Africa, these were some prominent activists in the U.S., including King, who was front and center. They actually had conferences in 62 and 1964 that unequivocally embraced the armed liberation movements and said that they rejoiced with those nations in Africa that had taken their freedom among the community of free nations. And even though, and they were talking about, this is amazing, they were talking about those revolutionary movements and struggles, not only in the North Africa, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, but also in the Portuguese controlled areas, Angola and Mozambique. And clearly these were liberation struggles to kick out and kill the criminals and enemies that were taking their land and colonizing the people. And King never once ever gave any hesitation or reservation to unequivocally support them. So what happens is this: we have these Pulitzer Prize winning authors such as David Garrow, who wrote Bearing the Cross. And so when I was doing my primary research on King, when I was a graduate student at Morgan State University, I actually used Garrow's reference. He made a 800 page, almost an 800 page book. He makes a reference to Dr. King's largest file. He said this: Garrow was his file on Africa. So I made a note of that before I went to the archives, and I said, "Wow, damn, it's a huge file." But Garrow never delves into the file in his book. He mentions how prominent and important the file was that King kept on Africa, more of a larger file than even the struggle that he was a part of, the Black liberation struggle in the U.S. He had a bigger file on the African liberation movement, the African freedom movement, but yet Garrow does not delve into the obvious record. And I also found something very troubling, very disturbing, that Garrow wins a Pulitzer Prize, but when you look at the speeches and records that he's referring to, he will make a summary of this material and use the three dots or use the ellipsis marks to skip over the part that contradicts the dream propaganda and contradicts what else he's saying. But because the book is so thick, unless someone goes directly to the record, they don't know that King is absolutely condemning the racist and what he consistently called it, the white supremacist policies and U.S. imperialism. That's taken out because it contradicts the presentation of King as an abstract dreamer. So this is fraudulent scholarship when you will use ellipsis marks to skip over the heart and the main substance of King embracing these liberation movements. But greatly for us and luckily for us, the Brother Tashaka, is that we do still have the public speeches that anybody can hear through YouTube. You don't have to go to the archives like I did to read the records and collect the records and assess the records. We can do that, but now we also can hear some of the speeches where King very directly is embracing African liberation movements, and this is what's been left out of the record. So any biography, including the recent one by Jonathan Ng, King A Life, it's the same old, same old. Some outside white guy who was never part of the struggle at all has this institutional backing, has the a great platform with huge resources to flood the market as a quote unquote another King expert, but he himself never involved, and it's always a white guy. Where is the mentee, the black person from the community that this guy is describing? They're never around. They're not receiving benefits from all this money that's being made. It's not only the money, but it's the disorientation away from the reality of what King was about. So people texted me the other day talking about we have to keep the dream. But like, what damn dream? Here you have one of the most practical men in the history of the country. So what happened, and I'll end with this, is that when I was working on my, I could tell a lot of stories when I was working on my King research with some of these research. But I do remember that one in Baltimore at Morgan State, one of the teachers he was a guest on one of the radio programs on WEAA Morgan State Station, and he was just describing that they had a exercise with the third grade class and asked all of the third graders to draw a picture of Dr. King as they saw him. So one of the young girls drew a picture of Dr. King lying in bed. So the teacher said, "Well, baby, why did you draw a picture of him lying in bed?" She said, "Well, he had a dream, so I thought he must have been asleep." and that's exactly what has been happening. He's been reduced to a dreamer. And so that's where we are today. So rather than a great activist who embraced liberation movements, he's now been reduced to follow and follow, pursue what dream?
Yeah, exactly.
People can't even find what that means. So anyway, that's some of what I think people need to know. And it's not just Vietnam, but it's the African liberation movements. And he drew light to the liberation struggle, also struggles in Latin America as well.
Before getting to my comments, Lao Tzu has a question. um, Dr. Ampim, where are the King's files located and are they accessible to the general public? Also, is it available online?
Okay, so thanks for the question. So the King files, the original files, you have to go to the King Center in Atlanta, the Martin Luther King Center for Nonviolent Social Change. So don't do like most people and just go downstairs and you look at the fountain where his crib is and the case with his shoes and his traveling Bible and the little video clip of when his birthday was made a holiday. You got to go upstairs. Now they're going to make it difficult. The King Center is the King family. Let's be very clear, has always been against researchers promoting something other than the dream because the dream sells. And regardless of someone's political focus on researching King, all researchers, with rare exception, have the same problem of just gaining access. But you go to the King Center, you go upstairs. Number two, the Mooger collection in Boston. And I don't know that this is really available online, unless someone's leaked some documents. You go to the Mooger collection, Boston University, where King did some of his academic work. The original records are there. FBI headquarters in Washington D.C. Because under the FBI, you have to go to a file called Communist Influence in Racial Matters. Communist Influence in Racial Matters, because the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover was so out of touch with reality, they argued the only reason that black people were rising up in the U.S. is because of outside communist influence. But if it wasn't for that, then all of the racial problems are made up. There's no issues. And our Negroes are very happy in the U.S. That was the FBI. And then under the communist influence and racial matters, then you have to drill down, and there's a subfolder called Black Nationalist Hate Groups. Let me repeat that, Black nationalist hate groups. So all of the groups were considered hate groups. The NAACP, CORE, SNCC, you named it, the Republic of New Africa, King's Organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, they all were called hate groups. The same as, they were in the same category as the KKK. So you go there, you check those records out. And then more recently, it's been some years now, the Stanford University, they also have the records of King there. You can find a lot of that online at Stanford. When I finished my works, the Stanford collection was not open, but Stanford, Claiborne Carson at Stanford, and the late Coretta Scott King, they collaborated to make sure that Stanford had records. And one thing that you should know is that the dishonesty and fraud is almost beyond belief. That Claiborne Carson and Coretta Scott King gave the blessings to write or create a Martin Luther King autobiography. How could somebody write another person's autobiography? Auto means self, and biography is a story. You can write a biography of somebody, but not an autobiography. But Claiborne Carson and Coretta Scott King, they carefully chose certain essays and certain speeches in order to tell a distorted story of King. King never intended to write an autobiography. He never set aside any material to write an autobiography. He never told anybody that he was considering an autobiography. No one influenced him to write or even think about an autobiography. This was 20 years after his assassination. Here you got a scholar who knows better, violates all academic principles, and they collected materials to come up with a selective set of documents and then call it the autobiography of Martin Luther King. Absolutely absurd. And if I was going to write his quote unquote autobiography, I would have put a lot of material in there that they excluded, like remaining awake through a great revolution, like Black Power Defined, like a testament of hope. How come they didn't put those in there? Because it's King challenging the American social order. As Dr. King said, that we need to be patient with the young nations in the world who are rising up like never before. It was Dr. King who said that Black people in the U.S., and we have to go to, and also around the world, have to go through the same process of the American Revolution that formed our nation. And we know that American Revolution was an 8-year war that was bloody to free America from British control. And this is what King said. So why did Claiborne Carson leave that out? Because it's propaganda. Why would the King widow approved that. That's not surprising. Why would the King family invite George Bush and Ronald Reagan to go down there every January and celebrate the King birthday when these were people who spent their entire political career to deny rights to black people and fought against Dr. King, his work, and his ideas? It's quite simple because the dream sells and they wanted the federal money. Now, if you don't know that, then you should really take a look at why there's been a split in the King family, those that want the money and those that wanted to be more honest to the legacy of the great Dr. King. One other thing I'll say about that is who would be pressuring the government for money if they're putting a monument in Washington, D.C. to honor your a great activist like King? All families typically are honored. And you see those monuments in Washington, D.C. to have among all of the people in the country someone honored with a statue. But the King family was arguing that we want money if you want to put his statue there. And so that's what we're dealing with. And this is not anything that's private. There's been a public debate about this. You look at King's children, 3 of them, and they've been fighting about his legacy. So anyway, King Center, you can get that material, but it may not be so easy. But you check out all of those records I mentioned, and that's how you can find the material. Oh, and one other thing I would say, you got to read his 5 books. You have to read his 5 books that he wrote, not books about him, and it's hard. I have a brother Shaka. I have a I have a assignment for students. You know what the assignment is? Next class period, bring back the 5 books that Dr. King wrote. You will get credit if you get all 5. If you don't, you get partial credit. And there, very few can do that because there's a lot of misrepresentation. All of the online access, how come people can't actually get his 5 books that he wrote? Because it's the narrative that's being controlled. So that's what we had to do, read his 5 books. And another book I will put in there along with the 5 books that he wrote. And maybe you all can use the chat and see if you can come up with those 5 books. But the other thing is that I also recommend A Testament of Hope, edited by James Washington. It's not a book written by King, but it does he does compile a lot of Dr. King's works over the 12 and a half years. So anyway, that's how you can approach the primary sources on Dr. King.
Okay, what you just heard, you ain't heard nowhere else. And Manu has done some extremely important groundbreaking work. One of the things I like about your work, Manu, is that you have both a focus on the past and the present, you know, both on ancient African history and on contemporary reality. And you and I share that in common. Because the question is, what good is the past if you don't apply it to the present? And then you're dealing with the figure that a lot of nationalists didn't touch because they bought into the view that this was some kind of an oatmeal movement because it was nonviolent. So I just want to make a few comments in addition to the ones you've made. Your point about King's pragmatism, and not to be confused with the American philosophy of pragmatism. King was not into that, but he was practical. And so his lens of Africa is viewed through the lens of not only an activist, but a successful one. And at the time he was dealing, in the case of Ghana and stuff, it was the success of the Montgomery bus boycott. But King always had this idea of victory for a just cause being extremely important. And he always understood that, on the one hand, Africans on the continent face colonialism. King defined the problem that we face, and he's particularly coming from the Southern perspective, as segregation. And so in both cases, they're dealing with a racist system. Now, I think if you looked at the country as a whole, he may or may not have problems with the definition that some of us have adopted, which is semi-colonialism. In other words, the racism, the poverty that's enforced through capitalism, which King was opposed to from the beginning, even before he was a revolutionary, he was opposed to capitalism. And while he was never a Marxist, he read Marx and he thought that he had it right in terms of his critique of what's wrong with industrial capitalism. He saw it as a system that basically raped and robbed and made people poor and exploited them. It was a basis for slavery. So King's view of Africa and the movements around the world, as you said, he embraced both the armed struggles and the peaceful struggles. Because, as you said, he was looking at the fact that in each case, it was the conditions that generated that. Now, in the case of Ghana, in the case of many of the African independence movements coming from the British had been so beaten up by World War II, their power was sapped. They didn't have the power to do much to resist. They're a little smarter than the French, who held out in Algeria and in Vietnam and got their behinds whipped, maybe in part because they had conspired with the Nazis and their country hadn't been smashed to smithereens the way the British had. But they were both second-rate powers. So the British really had no choice but to walk away from the Caribbean and to walk away from Africa. But it took a struggle before that happened. So King's embrace of what happened in Ghana, for example, he understood that was a successful movement because it employed a successful strategy. And I'm going to say this because Malcolm was my second master, but Malcolm put down the peaceful movement in the South, talked about it was cowardly. You're sitting in, laying in. People don't do that who are men. Now, what was the nation doing in terms of standing up for anything? And Malcolm was never critical of the Montgomery bus boycott, by the way, but he was not critical of Ghana. You understand? That gained a peaceful independence movement using the same tactics and strategies that King used that were successful in the South that produced Ghana's independence. So in the case of Nkrumah tried the peaceful way, and both King and Nkrumah shared this in common. They used this Gandhian principle of nonviolence. He called it passive resistance in a positive action. Nkrumah called his strategy positive action. But Amilcar Cabral, who's the genius of the armed struggles, called Kwame Nkrumah the genius of African independence because he produced it without shedding much blood. That is, without his people shedding much blood. They shed some, but not much. So they shared that in common. And Ghana reinforced for King his strategies that he was employing in the South. And I think Nkrumah saw in the King movement some things that were very similar to what he was doing in Ghana. So, in fact, Amilcar Cabral tried the peaceful way. It didn't work because the Portuguese had no intention of giving up. Their country wasn't bombed during World War II. They were neutral. They were a weak fascist power. But, you know, their cities hadn't been smashed. They still had an army. And the only wealth they had access to was in Africa. You know what I mean? So they were going to hold on. And so Cabral lost lives when he, you know, raised up a struggle by the dock workers in Guinea-Bissau and quickly concluded that the peaceful struggle would not work. So King was pragmatic, as you point out, and he was for what worked. He was for freedom anyway, but he understood that in some cases, peaceful struggle wouldn't work, and it would take an armed struggle. And in other cases, it might work. And then, as you pointed out in previous shows, he knew that the armed struggle approach in this country at that point was unworkable. I mean, in the South, are you kidding? But in the case of the deacons, they knew how to handle it. They knew how to finesse it. It's too bad the Panthers didn't look at them more closely because, you know, they knew how to take down the Klan. Mostly, they didn't have to. When they came to town, the Klan wasn't around. You hear me? You know, with Chilly Willie, anybody with a name like that, you don't want to go up against them. Plus, these were ex-World War II veterans. They knew how to shoot. And plus, the FBI couldn't get their hands on him because they know who was good and who was bad. They're Southern boys. You know what I mean? So this was a similarity that they employed similar strategies. And in the beginning, the African National Congress did as well. But King was for freedom. That was his main thing. Now, what's often not noted is that King was close to a great Pan-Africanist. His name was C.L.R. James. And in fact, when King leaves Ghana's independence ceremonies, he flies to London to meet with C.L.R. James. C.L.R. James is one of the founders of the Pan-African movement, the author of the Black Jacobins, the person who was the inspiration behind the Sixth Pan-African Congress, and the person who sends Kwame Nkrumah to London to introduce him to George Padmore, Malcolm Nurse, who organized the Fifth Pan-African Congress. And C.L.R. James stayed in my home for a week when we had African Liberation Day in 1977. I pointed this out on a previous show. He was a Trotskyite, and that's a special kind of Marxist that uses nationalism, but doesn't really have too much faith in it and stuff. But he was his own independent thinker. And when he was staying at my house, he read my manuscript on Malcolm X. It was written largely because of the way the Trotskyites had distorted Malcolm's legacy, along with others. But what he said after he read it, I'll help you get it published. I said this on a previous show before. That impressed me because you're supporting somebody you don't agree with fully, obviously. You know what I mean? I want to be like that. And so that was something that I tried to incorporate into my character, which I had done to an extent because CORE had that orientation in the San Francisco Freedom Movement. So the fact that he would stop in London for a special meeting with C.L.R. James, what is that telling you? That's telling you he hadn't just read his works, he was a Pan-Africanist. That was also true in terms of this big, thick file you're talking about. That's true in the way in which he related to African independence movements. He just wasn't running around using the word Pan-African a lot. Neither did Malcolm until he's forced out of the nation because Elijah Muhammad did not like Africa, by the way. He did not like Africa. He had ordered his members not to marry Africans shortly after Malcolm's assassination. I'm just telling you some stuff. People don't like to hear this. Too bad. You know what I mean? Malcolm did. So he had to do his stuff before his exit that was forced out of the Nation of Islam undercover. So he pushed the Bandung Conference more than he pushed. He hardly ever talked about the Fifth Pan-African Congress when he was in the Nation of Islam. So neither one, King didn't say Pan-African a lot, but he was talking Africa. And he was linking up with Africans. And by the way, King and Malcolm had agreement on human rights. King was more practical in his, and we'll get into this in a minute on the radicalization part. But Malcolm had a strategy on the Congo, which was to raise the issue of American intervention and oppression in the Congo. And he wanted to raise it as a part of his human rights strategy. And when King was going to get his Nobel Peace Prize, he raised it. It was coordinated because they both shared a contact with King's attorney. And so they would relay messages to each other. So this was a part of his Pan-Africanism. And when King is in Ghana, he's there. First of all, King was invited to Ghana by Kwame Nkrumah. But the person who managed bringing him in was a man named Bill Sutherland. I knew Bill Sutherland. I met him when we were in Tanzania in 73. And then in 84, I saw him again. And he was the highest ranking African-American in the Tanzanian government. But at this time, he was in the economics department of Nkrumah's government. And so Sutherland played a big role in arranging for a king to come to Ghana. Now, this is showing you Pan-African connections. And then King Nkrumah was bringing a lot of Africans from the United States, the Caribbean, Europe, into his administration because he was a Pan-Africanist. So that's important. So you can imagine what the conversation was about, because C.L.R. James is a deep thinker, an original thinker, you know. And so the attendance at Ghana's independence ceremony really impressed King, because he saw this as the victory for Africans gaining freedom. And he saw it as something that was very inspirational and inspired him in the pursuit of freedom for Africans in the United States. So this was extremely important. He saw Nkrumah and his crew, who had been arrested during the independence movement, coming in with their prison caps on. And I'm sure that reminded him of his own jailing and the jailing of other Black freedom movement activists. And then before he leaves Ghana, he's invited to have a special meeting with Nkrumah where they have a detailed discussion. And you can imagine what that discussion was like. So he had those kind of things. I just want to read the letter that that King sent to Kwame Nkrumah to Ghana. It was a year after his attendance at the Ghanaian independence ceremony, and this is his letter. Dear Dr. Nkrumah, and it's listed before that, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, Prime Minister, Ghana. Dear Dr. Nkrumah, I have been intending to write you ever since I left Ghana in 1957, after having a most rewarding experience at your independence celebration. Words are inadequate for me to express my appreciation to you for the hospitality that you extended to me and my wife. By the way, the people who sent King to Ghana was his church and the Montgomery Improvement Association. Black people sent him. You want to hear that? It was most gracious of you to take time out of your extremely busy schedule and receive us for lunch at your residence. These things will remain in my thoughts so long as the cords of memory shall lengthen. Since that time, I have watched you and the growth of your nation with great pride. I am sorry that I was in Mexico last summer when you were in the United States and did not have the opportunity to attend any of the affairs in your honor. I have just returned to the United States from India, and I was more than delighted to learn from Prime Minister Nehru and many others that you had been in India a month or so earlier, and that your impact on the Indian people was tremendous. I am sending you under separate cover a copy of my book, Stride Towards Freedom, which was published a few months ago. It's an account of our bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama, and also an exposition of my philosophical and ideological convictions on nonviolence. I certainly hope that our paths will cross again in the not too distant future. If I come to Nigeria next year for the independence celebration, I will certainly plan to stop by Ghana. So that's his communication with Kwame Nkrumah. It's hard to find any pictures of Martin Luther King at the independence ceremonies of Nigeria. I think you have a picture there, Manu, if you could put it up.
Yeah, it's kind of a glitch on it. So, but so it's kind of a glitch, Doc, on that picture. But there is a picture of King and Kwame Nkrumah in 1957 at the Independence Day ceremony. So the viewers, you can actually see, just put in King and Nkrumah at Ghana's Independence Day ceremony. You'll see those two giants together. There's a few pictures of King at one of the banquets as well with his wife, but you'll see the one picture with King and Nkrumah. Sorry, we can't show that one, but clearly that letter that Brother Tashaka just read, those are the kind of letters that you see throughout the file. And not just for Independence Day ceremonies, he's communicating with people who are literally at the time engaged in armed struggle against European colonialists. And this is the dominant material that he has in his file because this is what most interested him outside of the immediate struggle that he was part of in the U.S. And yet we have people writing massive books and not a single word, not a single section, not a single chapter. There's certainly no real focus on these kind of relationships. And I was looking at the chat. So, Brother Amir, sorry, I might not have pronounced your name correctly. I see in one of the chats you do have the 5 books correctly. It's hard to find out. I'll tell students you can only get the 5 books correctly if somebody's already compiled it, generally, unless you're quite diligent. So yes, Stride Towards Freedom is the first book. This was on the Montgomery bus boycott. Second one is, then he also wrote Strength to Love. That's absolutely correct. He was a minister. He also wrote Why We Can't Wait. He wrote that because the white supremacists were saying that, Dr. King, you're nothing but a troublemaker. You come to our towns and you mess up race relations. Why don't you let time solve the problem? King came back with a greater argument. He said time is neutral. It can be used effectively or ineffectively. He said the problem in America is the people of ill will are the ones that use time far more effectively than those of goodwill. What an argument. And then he wrote, of course, where do we go from here? Chaos or Community is the subtitle of that. And then Trumpet of Conscience. Those were a series of lectures that he gave in Canada called the Massey Lectures. So those are the 5. So you're correct in that, but it's hard to get the 5 and only the 5 because all the other stuff is mixed in there, like Measure of Man and his autobiography and other works written by others. Somebody, I think Lomax wrote a book. It was so ridiculous. Instead of Why We Can't Wait, he had supposedly organizing King material. He called it Why We Can't Quit. That wasn't the name of the title. And here's why King was so interested in the international struggle is because not only did he embrace Africa, he always said that was our homeland and that he was proud of his African roots and tradition. And when they had their organizational meetings, such as in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, they met at St. Helena Island there in the South Sea Islands with Black folks. This was strategic to embrace the African tradition. They could have met anywhere. How come they didn't go to the resorts like Black people do today? The so-called revolutionaries, they got the Hilton, the Sheraton, and King did not do that. They went to the South Sea Islands where it was a cultural root and foundation, and that's where they had the retreats. In fact, every year, Dr. King would go to Jamaica, not only for rest and relaxation, but reflection. Why? Because he was engaged in 20-hour-a-day struggle. And so for King, the reflection was, how can he be fresh? So this is how he wrote his 5 books, even though the man was working 20 hours a day, 6 days a week. He tried to take at least a Sunday off to spend some time with his wife and family. That was his only attempted commitment, really, is to at least try to be there on a Sunday. But his international focus to embrace Black people in the world is because that's what he saw. He saw the world as a place where he had a particular mission to fulfill. He felt that he was a world historical figure. And he would often use the German term Zeitgeist, which meant spirit of the times. And King translated that as a revolutionary spirit, and that he had a particular role. He didn't think that way at first. Dr. King started off, in Montgomery bus boycott. He was 26 years old. In fact, it wasn't him. It was the great Joanne Robinson. It was Edie Nixon. It was many other organizers who were ahead of King that organized the boycott, and they simply used Dexter Avenue Baptist Church as the hub to have the meetings, even before King agreed to it. King, this man had just finished, his graduate work, his seminary work, had a new growing family. He wasn't eager to engage in struggle against the vicious white nationalists and white supremacists in the South, but he was pushed into the struggle. And several years later, he admitted that he finally accepted his mission, which he had rejected for several years. He did not want to become a world historical figure, but by fate and circumstances, he adopted that mission, and he talks about that as he reflected on how he became the leader that he became, and this really concerned the FBI. This is like this is a man that we cannot control, and they understood that. You see that in their records, and so King didn't care. But one thing that should be added as to why people may not know, not only the misrepresentation by the media, by biographers, some former colleagues who were scared and afraid, but when King came out in 1965, this was after the Voting Rights Bill was passed, after a decade of struggle against the vicious Jim Crow system in America, to break down the fact that Black people had no rights in the U.S. So the Civil Rights Bill was passed in 64. The Voting Rights Bill was passed in 65. And so for King, he then began to turn to the international arena, and he began to criticize the vicious killing of innocent Vietnamese in the U.S. war in Vietnam, which he called criminal. But what happened was not only the liberal media, but it was the real civil rights cats, the people that were very limited. They were not going to go beyond limited Negro business. They began to attack King, the civil rights folks, just as much as anybody else. So he severed himself from the so-called, the conservative wing of the movement, the folks that were in the NAACP, the more conservative people in CORE, who left your organization, Doc, because they were not going to take it to the next level. They understood what their place was. So King was criticized so roundly in 1965 when he criticized the U.S. war in Vietnam that he backed away, because he didn't think strategically it was the best move at the time. He wanted to make sure that he didn't take away from the movement. But in 67, he said, to hell with it. It's a time to break silence. And so when the media was asking Dr. King questions, well, Dr. King, don't you think that you're talking about the international issues and you're criticizing your own government? Don't you think that's going to hurt the support of your organization? He said, excuse me, sir, you don't know me. And then he rose up and said that, and he criticized these people for criticizing him and challenged them to rise up. He said, that's their business. If they don't like it, that's their business. But this is me, and this is what I'm doing. It's one of the most angry that you've ever seen him at a press conference, to indicate that I'm not some slave. And in fact, these conservative folks were not only criticizing Dr. King, they criticized the Black Power movement. They even took it to a level that in October of 1966 took out an ad. They had a press conference to condemn the Black Power movement, the Black Power slogan. And then one of the reporters asked them, well, what does Dr. King think about this statement? It was 7 Negroes. And Dr. King agrees. King was as upset with that as anything you had seen, that these people tried to pull Dr. King in to an anti-Black Power statement and to condemn the young brothers and sisters who were rising up in this new phase in the struggle for true liberation and freedom in the U.S. So then King, in October of 1966, he took out a full-page ad in the New York Times. And you know what it said? King clarifies his stand, meaning that I don't embrace any condemnation of Black Power or the Black Power advocates, because he said this is real, that these struggles that they're raising and dealing with are real. And so you can see there's a fundamental split between King embracing international struggles and international liberation struggles, and those that were still stuck in Negro business in the U.S., because King made it very clear that there were 2 phases in the struggle. And in 1966, he's not dealing with civil rights anymore at all. He's talking about exclusively human rights, and he completely shifts. And this is when all of those mayors that gave King keys to the city in those early years and gave him a Nobel Peace Prize, even though he never had any association with the peace movement, they locked him in and blocked him in to this Gandhian nonviolent philosophy. But this was strategic. This was a great move on the chessboard to lock King into a nonviolent pacifist idea. And King recognized that because he had been locked into this concept, in 63 that when he came out in 1965 to embrace liberation movements, he had already been doing that, but he now does it publicly to embrace liberation movements. Then it was the criticism that's why he backed off until 67. He decided it didn't matter at that point, that he needed to step up as a leader and as a man of God, a man of the cloth who was concerned about the welfare of people in the world. And this is when you see the hot coals hit his lips, and he's condemning and criticizing everybody. And this is why King became hated all across America. Yes, I know they're giving him a holiday now. Yes, I know people talk about him nicely now, but we take a look at 66 and 67 and 68 and all of the criticism that he had rained on him, then you see, wow, this man was absolutely an enemy of the government, enemy of the state. He knew that, and they knew that. So that's why he was assassinated, because he would not stop. And the FBI said he was the most dangerous Negro in America. That was William Sullivan and J. Edgar Hoover. They made that determination. So that's why they had a Get King campaign from 1962 until they set up his assassination, because they recognized that if he becomes more animate in public with his work behind the scenes, which they were documenting and had everything was wiretapped, all the phone lines, all the microphones. They had agents in the organization. The FBI knew what the public didn't know about Dr. King, and this is what really concerned them, because he was embracing without hesitation or reservation those international movements, and the records are everywhere. And you don't only have to go to the archive to get this material.
Before getting into the rest of this, and then at the end, we're going to have any questions we haven't answered on the chat. We'll do that, and then we're going to show King's Riverside speech, and that will be the end of the show. But a few comments up here. One from Monique G. Problematic. Did Young, Wilkins, Randolph, Farmer, King, and Lewis take $1.5 million from the Stephen Currier Foundation and subvert the March on Washington? And then she has another one where she refers to Birmingham, and well, I'll come to that later. So this is a story from somebody who's in the movement. We had organizers in Birmingham. We're at the major phase of the San Francisco Freedom Movement. In fact, we had Will Ussery, who had been chair of San Francisco Core, was there and was observing it, and he came back and gave some reports. I wasn't particularly interested in studying the Birmingham movement because strategies work in particular circumstances. You can't import strategy. But, you know, we had that contact. And then we had a guy named Ike Reynolds, who was our field secretary, Corps field secretary from Louisiana. And he was there, and he was giving me reports. Bobby Kennedy had come in. This is in no book, by the way. And it told King that if he didn't call out Birmingham, he was going to call an IRS audit, the Internal Revenue Service audit on him. He continued with Birmingham. So before getting into this one on the march, I want to go to Miss Problematic on the other one that she had here. It worked. So Monique is making this comment. It worked in Birmingham, which King failed to desegregate before the Big Six gathered with Stephen Currier to subvert the movement. Okay. So King failed to desegregate Birmingham. That was not the major objective of King's movement. And to do that, he would have had to have been there for a number of years. King's staff had learned from their failure in Albany, Georgia, how to mount a successful movement. So they specifically picked Birmingham because Birmingham had the ingredients for success. The main ingredient was Bull Connor, and he would predictably act like a bull. And so it allowed them to unleash their strategy, which was a strategy that produced voting rights legislation, and then in Selma, and at this point, civil rights legislation. And so while in Albany, Georgia, the police chief Pritchard was smart enough not to unleash the dogs. He had read King's book and he just arrested them and just stuck them in jails. And if they filled the local jail, the county jail, and blah, blah, and busted the movement. So the success of Birmingham was that the very unleashing of dogs on young Black people, one that was successful because of King's best organizer, who had come up with the idea of bringing in the youth because the adults were afraid to engage in struggle. And King approved that. And so that strategy produced voting rights legislation. It was James Bevel's who came up with that particular tactic. So what was successful about Birmingham was it ended formally the new slavery. So let's not discount that. Let's not discount that. It did not produce desegregation at that time. And it did not produce the jobs that King also hoped that they could handle through Operation Confrontation. But it did produce that. Now, Monique Problematic's main question is, was money taken by the big six, SNCC, CORE, SCLC, NAACP, Urban League, from the Courier Foundation? Now, here's the history on that. When Birmingham takes place, we get word, because we have organizers there, that the people of Birmingham are planning a march on Washington. And they are going to stop everything. They're going to stop the planes from running at airports. They're going to stop the Congress from running. They're going to do everything they can to tie up the government of the United States until some real things are resolved for Black people. This was coming from the grassroots. There's another version of the March on Washington that this was being planned all along, and A. Philip Randolph playing a major part in that. But the fact of the matter is, when the Kennedy administration gets word of this, and this was not a movement coming from King's movement per se, it was coming from the grassroots, then they offered to fund this march. And so it's correct that this money came down from the Stephen Courier Foundation, which was attached to the Kennedys. We knew that in CORE. San Francisco CORE, we didn't participate in the march because we knew that it was being muzzled. King's speech, the I Have a Dream speech, was a real compromise, because while it was a classic King speech, based on the rhetoric, it was beautiful, it left out the real critique of what was wrong with the Kennedy administration in terms of dealing with the advancement of so-called civil rights legislation and everything else. And we know John Lewis's speech was censored. So that is correct. That did happen. So, but the key thing to get straight about King is this. King was like a giant. He was the maximum spokesperson for the Black freedom movement, and all kinds of pressure was on him at all times. His life was in danger at all times. On essentials, King didn't compromise, but he did make some, and that was one of them. You know what I mean? But I'm sure his view was that he wanted to get civil rights legislation, and so he was prepared not to offend the Kennedy administration when it needed to be, offended. So that is true. But do not discount that as therefore the movement was compromised and therefore it was finished. That's not true. Not with SNCC, not with most of CORE, definitely not with SCLC. And we're going to see in a minute, King becomes more radical, or let's say this, the radicalization of King can be fully expressed when the movement changes gears.
And Doc, Doc, also to aid your point, you just made. It's important for folks to know. Think about this. There were 250,000 people in Washington, D.C. for the March on Washington on August 28, 1963. Who was president at the time? John F. Kennedy. He was embarrassed by a march, a stone's throw from the White House for basic rights that black people didn't have. Kennedy was embarrassed. In fact, Kennedy tried to stop the march. He tried to redirect and call the whole thing off. So the fact that they went forward is because they weren't going. King was not going to stop their forward movement to expose the vicious racism in America that he said is as native as the pine trees, the sagebrush, and the buffalo grass. He said racism is so endemic to America that it lightly even burdens the conscience today. So let's be very clear that Kennedy is supposed to be a great civil rights president, but yet you have one of the greatest demonstrations for civil rights in the history of the country right near the White House. He was embarrassed. He tried to stop it and couldn't. In fact, Dr. King did not trust or really respect John or Robert Kennedy. He knew that these were politicians that would only do something if it helped their political career. He didn't trust them. He never endorsed them. He never endorsed the Democratic Party either. If you look at Dr. King, he's a leader. Of course, he has to interface and you don't get everything you want in a battle per se. You know, every group's going to give up a little something, but the bottom line is it was a forward moving, and he was non-compromising, as Doc said, to the essentials. But this was an embarrassment to the Kennedy administration. I think what happens sometimes is people listen at Malcolm's assessment, which is penetrating, but that's not the whole story at all. And in fact, Birmingham, and black people did not call it Birmingham, it's Birmingham.
Birmingham.
And the fact that, yeah, they would bomb everything. They bomb every meeting place, every church, everything you can imagine. So to stand up to these vicious racists and eventually desegregate the heart of segregation was a victory. It didn't happen overnight, but it happened. It didn't just happen just because of time. No, because of struggle. So because the one thing that has to always be added in is not only the bravery and leadership of these folks to say, to hell with you, Kennedy. We don't, King, you will see King never respected these people. King didn't embrace or ever say people should support Kennedy. That was not his position. They made Robert and John F. Kennedy show some humanity, which they didn't seem to show unless it helped their career. King said that. That was his position. But the other thing is that it was a longer term view and vision. So King's vision was to break down some of the structures and try to get laws changed and move on to other areas, other geographical areas. But eventually it was broken down in Birmingham, in Montgomery, and other places. So no, they didn't go shoot down everybody and get their rights immediately the next day. But it actually did have the intended effects to break down the backbone of segregation. So we have to also look at down the road, well, what happened months after that or the next year or so. So these white supremacists didn't just give up everything right away, but they lost. They got their ass defeated eventually.
That's the key point. Trump, Bannon, the right wing acknowledged that they were whipped. This movement whipped them. What they haven't acknowledged, but of course, even in acknowledging it, they want to ascribe the victory to Jews because they don't believe that black people would have either the courage or the smarts to kick their behind. And this is the same thing with removing Trump for the White House and putting him in line for the jailhouse right now. Black Lives Matter, bungling of over 1 million people dying from COVID that didn't have to. 40% of the world's deaths. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor rallied people and dumped him out of the White House. And if blacks aren't clear, if we aren't firmly united, he'll be back and you're going to see fascism fully formed in America. So it's very important to understand that the Black freedom movement, Monique makes this point that only black women, it was mainly black women who benefited from the civil rights.
The white women
who had benefited from the 64 civil rights legislation. No, that's from affirmative action. Yeah, they got more out of it than we did. Civil rights legislation, what that did was kill formal apartheid, which is new slavery. And if you don't appreciate that, you ain't looking at history. That's very important. Black people did that and did it before they did it in South Africa. You understand? With less resources than the people of South Africa had. So that was an extremely important of two-pronged victory right here. So I don't see the civil rights legislation as negative. I see its enforcement, and particularly voting rights that has been stripped of its enforcement powers as the real problem there. And Lyndon Baines Johnson, he didn't have Black people voting for the Democratic Party for 100 years. Black people voted Democratic when things were done in our interest. And that was the New Deal, you know, and that's when Blacks began to see some gains from their marching and demonstrating and putting their lives on the line in the streets that forced Johnson to make those kinds of compromises on what had been a very right-wing career before that. And what happened with the Democratic Party? White people left it. You hear me? Now, the Republican Party is the white party. I don't like to use the term because it's in death throes right now of white supremacy. White people ain't supreme in the world anymore. So let's move on now to King's radicalization from 1965 on and how it contributed to his opposition to capitalism, imperialism, and the war in Vietnam. And why don't we start by you putting up a clip of King's speech at an anti-war rally, and then we get into that discussion.
Okay, let's, all right.
And this is important because what we need to understand is how this radicalization of King is connected to a global struggle and his opposition to imperialism.
The North on as vast as that in World War II. All of this reveals that we are in an untenable position morally and politically. We are left standing before the world glutted with wealth and power, but morally constricted and impoverished. We are engaged in a war that seeks to turn the clock of history back and perpetuate white colonialism. The greatest irony and tragedy of it all is that our nation, which initiated so much of the revolutionary spirit of the modern world, is now cast in the mold of being an arch anti-revolutionary. Now, as a civil rights leader, I want to mention another thing that this tragic war is doing, that our nation cannot support both war and adequate anti-poverty programs. We can do both, but I warn that it is inevitable that the men of power Fine. All right. How are you? Ladies and gentlemen of the press, we have just had a meeting with Dr. Ralph Bunch, and I would like to mention the persons who served on the committee: Dr. Benjamin Spock. Dr. Benjamin Spock, I'm naming the persons who were on the committee that just met with Dr. Ralph Bunch. Dr. Benjamin Spock, Mrs. Dagmar Wilson, Mr. Dave Dellinger, Mr. Cleveland Robinson, and Reverend James Bevel, all of whom are part of this mobilization in a very significant way. The Secretary General, as you all know, I'm sure, Mr. Utant, is in Afghanistan today, and he had the Undersecretary, Dr. Bunch, to receive us and to receive the petition which we presented. And I'd like to read the petition, and then you may feel free to ask questions. From towns and villages, cities, we have come in tens of thousands to march and rally at the United Nations in New York and at the birthplace of the World Organization in San Francisco on this, the 15th day of April, 1967. We, the participants in today's unprecedented national peace demonstration, although of many national origins, faiths, and shades of political opinion, are united in our conviction of the imperative need for an immediate, peaceful solution to an illegal and unjustifiable war. We are determined that the killing be stopped and that a nuclear holocaust be avoided. We rally at the United Nations in order to reaffirm our support of the principles of peace, universality, equal rights, and self-determination of peoples embodied in the Charter and acclaimed by mankind, but violated by the United States.
Reverend King, did you have any exchange with Mr. Bunch over your differences of opinion as to the course the civil rights movement should take in this country?
Well, I think Dr. Bunch cleared that up himself the other day, so I didn't say anything about it. He came out with a press statement that he thoroughly understood my position. And I've made it clear all the time that there has never been an advocacy on my part of a mechanical merger of the civil rights and the peace movement. I have felt, however, that the spirit of the civil rights movement should certainly imbue the peace movement and thereby strengthen the peace movement.
Did you have any personal exchange at all, sir?
No, other than discussing this petition, and Dr. Bunch made it very clear that the United Nations and the Secretary General are very much concerned about the war in Vietnam, and he made it clear that they were very frustrated and disappointed that they were in a situation where they see for the first time a war taking place since the existence of the United Nations that they've been unable to do anything about.
Okay, that gives you a little insight there. In the first speech, the king is addressing an anti-war rally. In the background is who we know today as Kwame Ture, at that time Stokely Carmichael, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, was very active in the anti-war movement. And in the second picture there, where he's talking about his meeting with Utant, the head of the United Nations, on the side of him, the guy with the little crown on his head, that's James Bevel's. And then there's another big brother that he didn't refer to, that's Orange. I know these people because I was in the South. I did some organizing in Mississippi and various places. Mainly, my organizing was in San Francisco. What's interesting about those pictures is the people, and then Andrew Young is in the background, but the people that he had with him when he was doing a lot of this were the younger SCLC people, because some of the older ones, they had trouble with the position he took on the war in Vietnam. Now, what I wanted to do now, Manu, is get into just a very brief overview of King's radicalization, very brief, but to mainly discuss how King's radicalization on the struggle for liberation in the United States, Black people and of other people, how this contributed to his opposition to imperialism and the war in Vietnam, and also just putting it in the context of the growing radicalization of the movement that was occurring, a more radical movement that was occurring in the post-1965 period.
Yeah, that's very important because this is the latter or the second king that emerged that's almost never discussed or talked about at all. And so with King, his philosophy that he mentioned quite consistently was this. He said there were two phases in the black struggle, the civil rights phase and the human rights phase. He said that the civil rights phase ended when the voting rights bill was passed in August of 1965. And so that's what King said. In fact, it was Bevel, I believe, that said that actually King said in a sense, Congress has signed the civil rights movement out of existence because for him it was to get the laws on the books so that the police could not brutalize black people legally. So for him, it was to get the laws on the books and then turn towards the real important aspect of the struggle, which he said was uh, was the realization of equality and the acquisition of power. He said in this second phase, white people they're not gonna get off so easy. They're going to have to pay a price. And so for him, the shift was taking place because the movement over a decade had achieved what he believed were meaningful goals in terms of legislation. And he also said that what this period did in the beginning, this first period, that is, the civil rights period, as he called it, he said it taught black people to stand up for dignity and respect, and nobody can ride your back unless it's bent. And he said that that's what the period taught black folks. But now there's a price to pay for folks. And so this is when the shift takes place, when these laws are on the books. So this is why we see him and his organization, SCLC, completely shifting to now dealing with human rights, the acquisition of power, and internationalizing the struggle. And so that's that footage that you all saw, that's part of it. But let me also bring everyone's attention to one of the most important speeches. He gave many. One of the most important speeches he gave was the December 10th, 1965 speech during International Human Rights Day, where King exposed what was happening in South Africa. So, for example, in the speech that he gave at Hunter College in New York, King said this. He said Africa has been depicted for more than a century as the home of black cannibals and ignorant primitives. Despite volumes of facts contradicting this picture, the stereotypes um, persist in books, motion pictures, and other media of communication. Africa does have spectacular savages and brutes today, but they are not black. And then he goes on and calls the white folks spectacular savages. And he condemns these spectacular savages in South Africa. And so, how come this is not front and center? It should be because it's a clear shift for King. So he's not just dealing with the domestic issues in the U.S., although they're important to him, but he's dealing with international issues all over the continent. But this human rights speech that he gave was one of the most important. And it also should be noted that when they began to move from the South to not only internationalize the struggle beyond just the Southern issues, they also began to move to places like Chicago and help to move forward the Chicago Freedom Movement. And when King was there in 66, that is, in 67, he said that the basic issue confronting all nations is that of human rights. And he was definitely also talking about the U.S. And the people that opposed him were the Jewish community. Those are the ones that came out against Dr. King to condemn King because he was no longer dealing with quote unquote limited Negro business. Now there would be, as he said, extensive adjustments. There will be a price to pay. So this is the important shift that King made, and we see it everywhere. We see it in his speeches, his writings, his press statements. He is now he's quit the mayors that gave him keys to the cities. Now he's saying that that this is racism all over America. He said Congress was running amok with racism. But then he begins to criticize the war in Vietnam. But it's what he had been doing earlier, but he decided to pull back because of the criticism, but not anymore. And if we look at King's his writings, his focus, their national themes for the SCLC, they're all dealing with human rights and extending the struggle internationally. And this is consistent in everything that King is doing. And this is why he consistently points to the fact that human rights are the central issue confronting all nations. And so this is when there's a radical shift, a radical change. And this is when he became hated all across America. So let's not be naive, folks, to think that he was loved. No, there was absolutely opposition from the Jewish community there in Chicago, from the conservative leaders, Dorothy Height and A. Philip Randolph and all these Whitney Young. They were against Dr. King. And Dr. King, there was a permanent split. And King decided that when the movement split, that he would embrace the young activists in SNCC, the young activists in CORE. He protected Black Power. The only issue that King had, he did not think that using the slogan Black Power was wise, because it would make many people think and allow the media to take Black Power and associate it with white power. So he just thought that that organizing power had to be done under a more palatable term. That was his only argument, not that it needed to be done. He said the Irish and Italians, they don't go around talking about Irish and Italian power. They just organize for power. But eventually, King was challenged, and he himself began to even use the term Black Power. And so he embraced the movement very much so. He said in news interviews that he was in Chicago to implement, as he said, Black Power. He said that very openly because he was learning. Remember, he's only 39 years old when he's assassinated. And we can't allow people to lock King into a frozen concept of I had a dream and then distort that and not allow the man to make adjustments as needed. And so he did make adjustments, but he was far more progressive than many people. He embraced African liberation. Other people didn't go to Ghana. They didn't go to Ghana because they were not at that point that King was. So the internationalizing of the struggle is really what locked in King's assassination, because now it's him not just talking about Black folks in the U.S., but embracing liberation movements and criticizing, as he consistently indicated, American imperialism and the evils of the American society. It's a very different King that emerged in 66 and 67 and 68. And if his international work is not front and center, then it's a distortion of King and his focus, because that's what his focus was, along with transforming the political system in the U.S. He criticized capitalism. He condemned capitalism, but he knew that he was always being called a communist. So he tried to not get locked into these terms. So he just considered himself a socialized Democrat in order to try to get around the propaganda, because the opposition always called him a communist in order to minimize King's work and influence, to say it was always the Soviets that were influencing King and that everything he did was communist influence. But King decided to press on anyway. And he knew that he would probably not make it to the age of 40, but he pressed on anyway. That's why he and his wife always had a family plan, that they never traveled together on a plane or anything else. So if something happened to one of them, at least the other parent would be there for the eventual four children that they had. But the biggest part of King's work is international, and that has to be clearly the focal point if people are not going to distort King. No, Professor, no, he was focused on integration. Integration had nothing to do with King. Here's the four main aspects of King's life that had nothing to do with integration. Number one, his family was all Black. He could have crossed over. There's a lot of women around him. His family was all Black. His neighborhood, the Auburn Avenue area, was all Black. He could have went into an integrated neighborhood. He chose to stay, however, in the traditional Black neighborhood of Auburn Avenue area in Atlanta. So his family was all Black. His neighborhood was all Black. His church, Ebenezer Baptist Church, was all Black. And we all know that the most segregated hour in the country every week is Sunday morning at 11 a.m. How come King did not join an integrated church? Because integration was not a part of his focus. And guess what? His organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, was all Black. Well, what about Stanley Livingston? Look, just one advisor, that ain't no big deal. King recognized he was being criticized for not integrating his organization. So Stanley Livingston was one of several advisors to advise King. Why wouldn't he have an advisor? Someone of that stature, having to consider all of those things coming at him on a regular basis. It would be foolish and folly to not have informed people around him that he can trust and confide in and confer with in order to make sure that he was not making decisions that would catch him and bite him from his blind side. So to have one advisor in the ranks is outrageous. He didn't have any position per se, but this was formed by black ministers, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So think about it. His family was all black. His neighborhood was all black. His church was all black. His organization was all black. What's left? Every major aspect of his life was all black. And his plan has nothing to do with integration. King simply said that there could be unity around issues without uniformity. And this is what he writes about in Where Do We Go From Here? That how do we organize and implement black power to control our own economic reality, our own political reality? How do we use black power to work with the labor union? He didn't say give up your independent identity. He said work with them. You know, you can't be separated and isolated all by yourself. That's just political rhetoric. He was more informed and wiser than people who were just shooting off rhetoric. So King, the practical aspects of King remain focused on controlling the black community. If somebody doubts it, read his public work. Read Where Do We Go From Here? Or if you don't want to read that whole section, simply read Black Power Defined, and you'll see how he's defining black power and in how in the labor arena, the economic arena, the social arena, the political arena, how is it that the black community can control its own reality and destiny. He writes that. No one had to make something up about that later. It's what he was advocating for at the time. This is why the FBI considered him to be the most dangerous black man in America, because even when Malcolm was around, because Dr. King had a larger following. When they saw what they did in Washington, D.C. with 250,000, it could have been more than 250,000. It's just that King and the other folks were happy that it was that many, and they never challenged the National Park Service's numbers like people do today. Like, you know, they challenged the Million Man March numbers, and it was back and forth about numbers. So it's at least 250,000, if not more. But anyway, so these are some of the things people really should look at. And if I could just say one other final thing here, Doc, I want to see if I can share one thing. Let's see here. It's one file. Let's see if this can. If I think you can see this. This is a part of a book section, and what I share with my students about what King addressed in the second period, or what he called the human rights period, where he's not dealing with those issues that were related to civil rights that ended for him in 1965, but he called it the second period, and he called it the human rights area, and that's when he's talking about black power, about a structural problem in America, and this is when he's discussing and focusing on revolutions that needed to be supported, and he's internationalizing the struggle. And this is what Dr. King's focus was. This is almost always ignored because it's not convenient. And these are a lot of sources here where King is focusing on the next phase, the human rights phase of the struggle. So you can look at the speeches, the next stop, the North, or his address to his organization. Frogmore, by the way, was in South Carolina, the South Sea Island area with traditional African descendants there. You got speeches like Crisis and Civil Rights. Look at the themes of his organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. They're not talking about civil rights anymore. They've already looked at the international struggle and how the black struggle in the U.S. fits into that. Look at the themes: human rights in 1965, basic issues, the Grand Alliance, and then in 66, human rights, the continuing story. Or, as I mentioned a minute ago, the Human Rights Day speech that he gave. He said that we live in an era which the issue of human rights is the central question confronting all nations. So these are just some of the things that need to be focused on in the international focus of Dr. King, because he's been mummified and frozen in the concept of I Have a Dream in his international work and his embracing of liberation movements around Africa and Vietnam became more popular. But the African liberation struggle, his files and interests in communication with those activists were far more with those activists in Africa than in other places. So those are some things that definitely should be noted. And one other thing that I think Monique had mentioned, I think you addressed some of it, Doc, but I saw a question she raised about how did white women get all of the benefits. It's because the term minority was used. So instead of, in the legislation that so-called minorities have to have, contracts with city, city projects. And so they define a so-called minorities not as Black people or people of color, but anybody that was discriminated against. So then you have the largest group in America, white women were defined as so-called minorities so that they can benefit from Black struggle. So it was all this game of using semantics to use the term minority to include white women so they can then keep the wealth and jobs and all of the things in the white family by the use of that term, minority. So white women have definitely been the beneficiary of Black struggle.
Very good. I just want to add a few things, and some of these just all of them tack onto what you were saying. First, in your overview of King as not an integrationist, even though he unfortunately used the term, and by the end of his life, he rejected it. He said you'd be telling Black people to integrate into a burning house.
Right.
But that was the language of the Black establishment. That was also the language that he heard when he's going through college. It does not conform with his life. Why? King was a product of new African or African American culture, which, if people bother to read my book, The Integration Trap, Generation Gap, Caused by a Choice Between Two Cultures, I devote nearly 90 pages to discussing our culture, a neglected subject. You hear me? With some of us confused and acting like we don't, and say we don't have a culture. And we've confused our youth on this because a lot of them think they don't have a culture. King was very clear that he did. And as you point out, he came from a Black reality. Everything in his life was Black. His major influences, Benjamin Mays, in charge of Morehouse College, one of the giants in the educational field, was not only a supporter of King, but of the Black freedom movement and a host of others. And while there's a Stanley Levinson, he ain't the primary advisor. You hear me? It's people around him. The people who wrote most of his speeches were Black, But the key point is, King operated on the guiding principles of African American culture, the best of it. He came from Black middle class culture, but it's rooted very much in the souls of Black folks. And so what was the guiding influence of King? Spirit, baby, God. And it was manifested in his dignity, which is the dignity of Black folks. And don't put this down. They called him the Lord in the movement, and sometimes that was kind of to laugh at, but he was a dignified person. But the key point is he brought, as the movement did, because you have no Black liberation movement in this country, no African liberation movement in this country and in the world, if spirit is not tied to politics. If it's just politics, Black people ain't coming into it. So this is a key point. Spirit was at the heart of what drove him and what drove the movement, especially the Southern movement. And then family, these two things were like really very important. And then Black consciousness is the glue that ties together African American culture, because we come out of African societies, many different types, over a period of time. We forgot what part of Africa we came to. By the way, this culture gives birth to pan-Africanism through Ethiopianism. Princes shall come out of Egypt. Ethiopia shall stretch forth its hand unto God soon. And that becomes the basis for what in the first Pan-African Congress held in London in 1900 becomes a Pan-African movement. And so when King is embracing Pan-Africanism, he's embracing African-American culture. And as Africans in the US and in the Caribbean, especially Trinidad, that give birth to Pan-Africanism. And for the ignorant on the internet who are putting down Pan-Africanism, you are being fooled. Those that are pushing that are pushing the philosophy of the Bannons. They love Europe. Don't you see Bannon all over Europe promoting pan-Europeanism? Right wing, huh? But you're not supposed to unite with your own people? You hear me? Something in short supply among some of our people is common sense that ain't so common anymore. Use your common sense. Since when are you going to say that unity is something with your people you don't want? Since you say that you were born on a plantation, and that's the beginning of what, if you want to call it your nation. But it seems to me the only thing you want in this nation is some reparation, which is a paycheck, and you're entitled to that. But if that's all you want, you think reparation is going to give you liberation? The Jews control banks and industries in Germany. And when they got finished with them, they had their gold teeth. If you think that money alone is freedom, you are making a mistake. So King was the best manifestation, along with many others, Ella Baker, many others, many of our people, of our culture. And it's everyday Black folks that manifest that. You hear me? And King was a product of that. And that's what he served. He cared most about the poor, as Malcolm did, as many of us in the Black freedom, Black liberation, Pan-Africanist, Afrocentric, and other movements do. King's definition of human rights. Malcolm reached the conclusion that we needed to move from civil rights to human rights. And that came from his growing maturity in and out of the Nation of Islam, where he came to appreciate the power of the Black freedom movement. And what essentially his human rights strategy was doing was internationalizing the Black freedom movement. And I pointed this out before, he and Adam Clayton Powell were planning a Black Power conference, which really gave birth to Black Power being popularized, because that was a notion in our culture for a long time. And Kwame Ture and I were friends. He'd stay at my house. We'd put security on him. My organization, Pan-African People's Organization, he didn't like it because he wanted to see his girlfriends and stuff and be free. And we said, ain't nobody blowing you away, wherever it is under our watch. And so you're under secure security. You ain't going nowhere unless our Simbas are protecting you, trained in martial arts and counterintelligence. Somebody makes a move on you, we're going to put them in the groove. You understand? So I never had the opportunity. I always forgot when we were talking to tell him that. He didn't know, but everybody knew the spirit of Malcolm was up in there. So when Willie Ricks hears the cry Black Power at a conference held by Adam Clayton Powell after Malcolm's death, that's what he whispers in Kwame Ture's ear, then Stokely Carmichael, in the March Against Fear, the James Meredith March in Mississippi. And Kwame told me, he said, you know, Willie Ricks whispered in my ear to say Black Power. But, you know, and I'm going to get Willie on this program because I really like him. Mkaza, what's his full name?
Mukasa Dada. Yeah. Mukasa Dada. Yeah.
Mukasa Dada. I like the brother. And it's obvious he got him a nice wife and got a son looks just like him that has finished medical school in Cuba. You know what I mean? And so he said, I didn't know if I should say that because, you know, Willie kind of crazy. You know what I mean? So I'm going to tell Willie that if he ain't been watching, I know he watches some of the shows that he's listed, but if he doesn't know that, I'm going to tell him so he can laugh. But, you know, the key point is that Malcolm was a major influence on this, and Malcolm was moving in the direction of human rights to internationalize the struggle and take America before world bodies, World Court, the Organization of African Unity, the United Nations. Unfortunately, most of these institutions have no biting power, and some of them controlled by the United States, at least by their veto power. But it was an interesting and good move. And King supported that. But King was more practical in his definition of human rights. When he said that when they signed those civil rights bills and stuff, that was the end of the civil rights movement, what he meant was that Civil rights is what's guaranteed under the Constitution, but we had been excluded. So these bills were incorporating us into it, the right to vote, and freedom from this segregation and all this kind of stuff, new slavery and all of this. But he said, we're now entered the realm of human rights that the Constitution doesn't grant. And that's the right to a job. That's the right to a roof over your head. That's a right to medical care. That's the right to good education. And then he added to that, because he thought that capitalism was a vicious system, the society needs to be restructured, because that alone is not revolutionary, but that alone is good. I mean, if you have all those other things, but as long as the rich are getting rich, the poor will get poorer. So he had that. And then he had a transformation of values, where, because he was talking about a thing, materialistic oriented society, to one that is oriented towards humanism. So that was the move that King was making when he moved north. He wanted to address those issues. Now, there was a deep split in SCLC. They did not want to move north, and King's best mobilizer was among them, because King didn't organize. He was a mobilizer. He did marches. Organizing is when you put people into structured groups. And so Bevels told him, you go to Chicago, and Daley, who was the mayor of Chicago, he's going to eat your lunch. And he was right. He did. And so this is, you've heard this before, a few of you, and you have, Manu. This is my critique of King's movement north. He didn't have the strategy for the north. He didn't have it. He had the commitment. He had the long-term vision, but he didn't have the strategy. And the proof of the pie is in the pudding. When he moves to Chicago, they're dealing with housing as a mass issue. And they're moving into these ghettoized white communities. And he saw more violence and racism there than in Mississippi. Of course, he didn't demonstrate in Mississippi. He was smart to stay out of Mississippi. King would have been shot the first time he had a mass march in Mississippi. He came in and gave speeches and left, and he should. He should leave Mississippi. SNCC and CORE organized Mississippi. They shouldn't, because King was just too big of a target. But the point is, the usual definition of how you approach the North when it came to programs was housing, education, and employment. With the Panthers, you have the add-on of self-defense and dealing with the police. And Black Lives Matter has added that on. But there, as King pointed out, the Northern movement had been playing around. The Northern movement didn't have successful strategy. That was James Boggs' point, except for one movement, the San Francisco Freedom Movement. I met King in 1964, and he had had a meeting with Rabbi Alvin Fine, who was the leading rabbi in the Jewish community, was very supportive of the Southern Freedom Movement and very opposed to the San Francisco Freedom Movement, which was typical of the Northern liberal. They could support something far away, but when it was in their own backyard, oh no. And so when King had finished that, then I got into his car and we went to, he was driving to the Cow Palace. I was driving my girlfriend's car. I didn't have a car. I didn't have no money. I had 25 cents in my pocket, full-time organizer, get no pay. And so I asked him to support the Bank of America campaign. He said he would. And then I walked back to my car, went to the Cow Palace and heard him speak. He was so vague on it, you wouldn't know what he was saying, because he would have offended the ministers who had been with us, but had sold us out. But the key point is this. The San Francisco Freedom Movement understood something that Northerners didn't understand, and I'm afraid up to this point has not been understood. Black Lives Matter is a good movement, a movement against the police, and that's been a firing up issue. They've handled it better than the Panthers did. Even though the Panthers show bravery and everything else, they really didn't know how to use it in a way they keep their members alive. You know what I mean? And I'm not just putting this on them, because then they came under FBI attack and so forth, and they devoted their resources to destroying them. But Black Lives Matter has been very good at using that and rallying and mobilizing. But the Northern movements have missed the point. There's a report, I mentioned this 2 weeks ago, by the founder of Black Lives Matter. One of the founders of Black Lives Matter, where they interviewed 200,000 Black people of all ages on what's the central issue facing you. And it's one that the San Francisco Freedom Movement understood. And it was this. They said, main issue for them, and this was the top issue, was the lack of good paying jobs that would enable you to support a family. In my time, when we interviewed Black folks, because we went out and asked them what did they want, that's been a mistake in the North. We have usually gone out and organized based on what leaders thought was the issue, but not asked people what they were. You didn't have to do that in the South. It was pretty clear. Segregation. It was the denial of the right to vote. What did they say? Jobs, jobs, and jobs. It's still the issue. The unemployment rate among elders in the Black community, older people, is 20%. They say it's 10%, and it's 80% for the youth. So if you don't think that's the first issue, then you're missing the point. And poverty is a big issue. And it's a growing issue, not just with us, but other groups, including whites. You hear me? So King did not really understand the Northern movement and, Northern conditions. And so he didn't have any victories after that. So that's my little critique right there, that Jesse had a better understanding, though Jesse is not King by a long route, and he didn't have it on the level that you needed to benefit poor Black people. But he did deal with some economics in terms of some jobs and stuff, but it wasn't really mass-based. It wasn't in the interests of Black people per se. So that, I think, was King's weakness. But his strength was that he had an idea of restructuring this country. He had a radical orientation, and that orientation led him also to be very critical of American imperialism. So King, there's a question up here and I'll answer it. King had said he was in a contradiction, telling Black people in the US to be nonviolent while America's telling them to be violent in Vietnam. He said, how can I be inconsistent on this? If I want peace, then I want it globally. And he's not saying that the Vietnamese should be peaceful. They had no choice. They had to fight. But he was saying that the violence that America was inflicting on Vietnam was wrong and it needed to end. And when he said that, that's when he came full-throated out against the war in Vietnam. That's when the Johnson administration came down on his head. And that's when decisions were made, along with his stand on poverty, to take him out. And we covered this in a previous show. The documentation is pretty clear that military intelligence was given the job to do it, with the mafia as the backup on the assassination. And it was taken out on the same day, a year later, as the Riverside speech. King was growing, and particularly in his international thrust, was taking a threatening position to the system, because it's one thing for somebody you've never heard of to oppose a war in Vietnam. It was another thing for his wife too. His wife had taken a stand before he did, but it was King. As big as King is, that's something that would put the heat on the system. You hear me? And so as a result, executive order was issued. And then they fight a King holiday, but you get a King holiday and a statue in Washington, D.C., where the decision was made to execute him. Now, just a few other things, and then you can make your comments, Manu, and we'll see if there's any other comments here, then we'll go to the Riverside speech. Alliances and coalitions. I saw a comment here that if we do alliances and coalitions, that's the end of us. Anyone that makes that statement doesn't understand anything about power. The most powerful nations in the world have alliances and coalitions. You hear me? Show me one that didn't, and you can't show any, because whether it's war that's violent or whether it's war engaged through peaceful means, alliances and coalitions are key. The question is, you should read my book, The Art of Leadership. I deal with this, but this has been my experience. The question is, who controls them? And you only do them when you have to. You only do them when you're fighting around an issue you can't win on your own. If you can win on your own, fine. What's wrong with radicalizing people other than blacks while you're radicalizing blacks? Your culture is the most radical culture in this country. So when you go into motion and you put forward principled positions on human rights, that issue affects everybody. That affects others. I was watching something on C-SPAN. It was a young sister who was teaching at Brown University, and she was giving a lecture on the Black Panther Party and then the Brown Berets. And it was interesting, but she missed a point. If you looked at the Brown Beret program, that was a Black Panther Party program. The Black Panther Party not only radicalized Latino Americans, Puerto Rican Americans, but as the Minister of Culture of the Black Panther Party, Emory Douglas, had pointed out on a previous show, because of the nature of African American culture, it inspired Native Americans to form the American Indian movement. Now, that's the one group that doesn't need much inspiration. They've been at war with this system from the beginning, and they have a powerful culture, and they're natural allies for us. You're going to say, we don't need allies. Then you tell me about the Seminole Wars. They're the only wars that Native Americans won, and the only slave revolts that blacks won. Because we had an alliance of those two. So King had his alliances. What's wrong with that? As long as you're running it, as long as if you're coming into a peace movement, you're taking your own stance. You're not following anybody else because he made the decision to enter that. But note that the anti-war movement started from blacks. Blacks opposed that war in Vietnam first, and from black leadership, Malcolm, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and then later King and others. We're the ones that took stances, and it was on principle. It wasn't because just because our kids are getting killed over there. That was the main reason why whites opposed this war. It was also principles, but a lot of it was they didn't want to die because their buttons were getting whipped in Vietnam. You understand? Whites are generally very supportive of wars of imperialism as long as they can win and get the goodies, So alliances and coalitions, John Henry Clark used to make that comment, we're alone. Yeah, we are alone in a sense, you know what I mean? Slavery, a lot alone, but there were even allies there. But the key point is, if you know anything about power, power is whatever you need to bring to bear on a point that you're going after to win. I'm a strategist. I've never lost a battle, and I've led some of the most complex in the last 50 or so years. And I've always known when I was going to win because I had a strategy to whip you. That's the key. Strategy, baby. Strategy. And the 3 rules, WWW, win, win, win. That was what King's rules, by the way. King didn't feel good when he get no wins after 65, but he got a win. His win was he was a part of a shift in consciousness, a radical shift. And that radical shift is one here today. And what I'm seeing with young blacks, and Ogawa is always pointing this out to me, that's some of the most awakened group that we're seeing among blacks right now. Young blacks, you hear me? Young blacks. And this woke thing that they're afraid of, that the right wing is also exaggerated, that's where it's coming from. And guess what? When it comes from us, it spreads everywhere else. So King's opposition to the war in Vietnam was an extension of this radicalization, and it's pretty clear that the same issues arise in Palestine today. That there you have a settler colony, and the end game of the Israelis, the Zionists, is not only remove them from the land, but remove them. And if you quote what Netanyahu has said, he was quoting from one of the most vicious passages of his holy book, but it's also in the Bible. We will kill all of them. Men, women, babies. You hear me? And now they're talking about they want to clean the Gaza and bring in white settlers, Israeli settlers. And the U.S. is talking out of two sides of their mouth about we want a two-state solution. And Netanyahu is saying exactly what they knew he would say, hell no. And the U.S. would have a good chance of enforcing a two-state solution if they decided that the military aid, the billions of dollars that Israel gets free, is not coming, and that every other means will be used to cut you short. Now, it still wouldn't be easy because the Israelis have their own arms industry. It's a strong arms industry. So whether or not you could stop them, it wouldn't be easy. But if there's any power that has the power to do that, that's the United States or the United Snakes. And so the question is, will there be the kind of force applied to them to force them to do that? And the world now, power relations have shifted in the world. The world is opposed to Israel now. Israel has been put in the genocidal list. And this trial that's been brought to The Hague by the South African government, that's great. Charging them with genocide. And under UN definition, we talked about this last week, they easily qualify, even though that's a compromised definition. It's very clear. 3 months, no food, no water, destroying all their hospitals, all their universities, all their infrastructure, and not having found but a handful of, the leaders of the insurrection in the Gaza. Only a handful. And they knew that would be the case because they're guerrillas and they hide in the cracks. They knew that. They don't care. It's a good justification for keeping Netanyahu in office a little longer and for wiping out the Palestinians. And so just as King had a position in opposition to imperialism in this case, in Vietnam, that same opposition extends to the Palestinian people and any other people who are facing this same kind of harsh oppression. You want to say anything in conclusion before we get to the Riverside Church then?
Yeah, I'd like to add that in terms of King's international work, I see a couple of questions there. King was dealing with international issues long before Malcolm and just about anybody else, but it's not known. King not only embraced the independence of Ghana, but he was speaking out about international issues for quite some time. You can go back to 1957, when King is dealing with the birth of a new age. And for him, it was a revolutionary age. And King also, for example, him shifting to deal more largely with international issues. We see it not only in his profound Human Rights Day speech in December of 1965, where he called these Afrikaners in South Africa. He said they were spectacular savages and modern day barbarians. Also in that same year, when King was in Jamaica, what did he do? He went to the grave of the Honorable Marcus Garvey to give special respect to the greatest organizer on record, Garvey, and the UNIA. So King would not have done that if he had issues with Garvey and Garveyism, focusing on Africa for the Africans, those at home and those abroad. This is exactly how King thought and felt. But his international focus has been misrepresented and distorted. I mentioned the American Negro Leadership Conference on Africa. They had two important conferences, one in 62 and another one in 64, where there was an unequivocal embracing and support of African liberation movements. So I'll just give you one statement, for example, and King is in the center crafting these public statements about embracing African liberation struggles. So, for example, this is the American Negro. This is one. I'll give you another organization that people are probably not too familiar with, but in 64, this is one of the statements that said, this is American Negro Leadership Conference. King is the central founder and organizer in that group. We support the nationals of Angola and Mozambique in their struggle for freedom and independence. And if you look at what was happening in Angola and Mozambique, these were bloody liberation movements. There's no qualification that they should be nonviolent or peaceful in negotiation, none of that. It was unequivocal support. And not only that, King was a prominent member of the American Committee on Africa. Now, the leader of that group was George Hauser. So when George Hauser in 67 goes to Africa to also report on the ground, they also issued a statement in full unequivocal support of armed liberation struggles in Africa and to embrace them, to elevate them, and to call for their political and material support. So King was a part of these efforts to have an influence on U.S. policy in Africa and the state of affairs on the African continent itself. So this is the ongoing political work of King that has not been talked about, that's not been written about, because people have not gone to the record. They've not gone to the source. And then we have all of the propaganda biographies that are out there, and the authors, they flood the media with interviews in print and radio and TV, and people think it's real. It's not real. These are outside. Like, I'll give an example. Taylor Branch, when he wrote Parting the Waters, when he wrote that book that also was a Pulitzer Prize winning book, I was working on my master's thesis entitled The Revolutionary Dr. Martin Luther King. Taylor Branch was on the radio at Morgan State spewing out, some superficial things. So I called into the station. I said, Mr. Branch, I appreciate your comments, but can you please talk about the second king that emerged? The king that emerged and started to focus on the acquisition of power for Black people and human rights. Please talk about the second phase that he wrote so extensively and talked so extensively about. Second phase, I'm not aware of that. And so I said, excuse me, sir, you wrote 1,000-page book, and that was only part one, and you telling me in this audience that you're not aware of Dr. King's the second phase of his work? How can you not be aware? It's in his sermons, it's in his interviews, it's in his articles, it's in his books, it's in the FBI records. What are you talking about? Oh, I'm not familiar with this. Please, if you can leave your number and I would like to talk to you and I'll give you a call. Left my number, and decades later, ain't heard from the cat. And what makes it even more criminal, Taylor Branch and his other white guys, Taylor Branch lived in Atlanta. That was the headquarters of King. And he said that he never met Dr. King because of disinterest. Excuse me, what are you talking about? He's disinterested in other human beings being brutalized by vicious racists, and he's disinterested. He never met King, never did anything to assist him. And then decades later, he's the so-called expert that's misrepresenting the history and focus and contributions of Dr. King. That's what's happening now. So King was far ahead because Malcolm was in a straitjacket. Elijah Muhammad, and they talked a good game, but they were on the sidelines. When Malcolm broke from the nation, that's when he wanted. And the other question I saw, that's when Malcolm was free to travel and recognize that all of what he had been told was not accurate. That anybody can practice Islam or become a Muslim, regardless of their ethnicity. So that opened up Malcolm's eyes. Also, Malcolm recognized, and he always wanted to be a part of some part of the so-called civil rights struggle, but the nation held him back. And Ella Baker also, so Malcolm finally, when he leaves the nation, he's advised by the great Ella Baker, say, Malcolm, don't be naive. Some of these cats are very conservative. So you can work with some people, but don't think everybody's going to be so open to you. So Malcolm understood that King was very progressive, and Malcolm went to Selma in early 1965, early March, in order to meet with Dr. King, who was in jail at the time. It was one of the demonstrations that they were organizing. But he went to Selma to meet with King and offer his support and to say that I'm with you. And King and Malcolm was saying that, look, either the racists will deal with King, and if they don't deal with King, they're gonna have to deal with me. So this was making for Malcolm to make King's work a little bit easier. They figured, well, shit, we might as well deal with King, because what Malcolm was talking about was even more radical. But the bottom line is, 2.5 weeks later, Malcolm was assassinated. So that that alliance that Malcolm was looking to forge with King and those in the movement, it didn't take place because that was one of the biggest concerns of the racist establishment. And Malcolm didn't get a chance to meet with King when he went to Selma, but he did meet with his wife, and he made sure that message was relayed. But they clearly had more in common than they had in conflict, and the government was aware that this kind of alliance is pretty scary. But so we have to rethink most of what we believe we know about Dr. King. Even his most public material has been distorted. How about that? The man gives a 16-minute speech that's been promoted as the I Have a Dream speech, and he's there, as he said, to dramatize a shameful condition and to challenge America to live up to his fake and phony creed. So this is what they were there to do, is dramatize a shameful condition and to advocate for jobs and freedom for Black people. And because he condemned police brutality twice in the I Have a Dream speech, he condemned racists, because he's challenging how America was the last 3 minutes or so, because he's a leader and you have to inspire people to act. That's why King said, despite all of these issues, I still have a dream that one day things can change. And that's where the media comes in, and then they just start running with the dream speech. So what I do is I flip the script. I show the first 12 minutes and I cut it. Whereas the media starts with the last 3-4 minutes when he's talking about a dream. He's not in D.C. to talk about a dream. He's in D.C. to challenge the racist America, including John F. Kennedy, who he did not respect. He never endorsed him, and he didn't trust the man. So we really have to look at these international connections of King. So my work, Martin Luther King, The Evolution of a Revolutionary, I'm going to get to publishing it, but this is what I had started many decades ago, because it's quite alarming to read and learn about the real King versus the propaganda that we hear so much about. So I just wanted to share that, Doc, that that's what the task is to go to the record, to go to the source, and not all of the nonsense. But it's not easy, because if you, as I said earlier, we got the 5 books, but it's not easy to get those 5 books, because you'll run across Measure of Man, you run across the autobiography of King and a lot of other things, or the biographies for outside white guys who have become the so-called experts on Black struggle. And they themselves did not lift a finger, did not take a step, did not do anything, but they're reaping the benefits because they all have won Pulitzer Prizes as they chronicle, or should I say mischronicle, the story of not only King, but the movement in general. And I don't accept any of it. The records are clear. You can go to the website, advancingtheresearch.org. I have a couple of my King articles there that you can look at. King and the misrepresentation of the whole nonviolent movement, as well as King and Black Power, because Gandhi and the Gandhian philosophy that was imposed on King by Rustin and others, it helped put King in a straitjacket. But let's be very clear, Mahatma Gandhi is one of the most vicious anti-racists on record. All one has to do is read his autobiography, right, or his column. He wrote a column.
Black people.
Yeah, he had no respect for Black people. He wrote a column called My Opinion. It was a weekly column when he was in South Africa, and he always called Black people on a regular basis. He called them kafir, which is nigger, really. And it's disrespectful, because Gandhi had no respect for Black people. And not only that, but Gandhi participated in not 1, not 2, but 3 armed conflicts. He volunteered. Gandhi was no ultimate pacifist. He was a strategist who recognized the Indian folks were not going to beat the mighty British. So this was political strategy to use nonviolence. It was not a way of life. And Gandhi made it very clear that he advocated the training in arms for those that didn't want to use nonviolence. He also made it very clear that when he was attacked, that his son should have used arms to defend him. So the use of arms was not some great way of life. It was whether or not it was practical. That was Gandhi's position, who was a vicious anti-African racist. And he even voluntarily participated in the Zulu rebellion because he didn't respect Black people. And Gandhi wanted to show his loyalty to the British Empire. So this is what the issue is. So if you find King associated with Gandhi, people did that. And King is still learning. He's still growing. Before King recognized a lot of these things that were going on around him, such as labeling him as a Nobel Peace Prize winner, before he even said a word about world peace, he's already they had already pegged him. So this is why it limited him in some of the earlier years to come out totally publicly about his international stance. However, if you look at the American Negro Leadership Conference on Africa and look at some of his speeches and his sermons and his essays, wow, there's not a time that he was not embracing Africa and African liberation struggles. It's just that it was not part of his main focus because he did not want the movement's image to be harmed until at that point after 65, he didn't care about that anymore. So we really have to look at two kings that emerged. People can accept that Malcolm, and you're one of the first experts on this, Doc, but people can see that Malcolm made a shift when he was in his 4 phases in Malcolm's life, you know, from his 4 phases, but the phase from when he's in the nation and then out of the nation, this is a shift. King also makes a shift. To try to lock somebody into a concept of I had a dream and freeze him in that is foolish and folly, but that is what has been done. And even in the speech itself, if you just look at and read listen at the first 12 minutes. And by the way, go to AmericanRhetoric.com, AmericanRhetoric.com, and you listen at the authentic, verified I Have a Dream speech. It's 16 minutes. Listen at the first 12. Ain't nothing about a dream. So when I play the first 12 minutes, most people, they don't even know what speech it is because they haven't heard it before. They only hear about the dream. This is to separate us from struggle. This is to separate us from the practical work of Dr. King, which, by the way, he lays out. And where do we go from here? He lays it out of how do we organize a practical plan and not just the speeches. And his last project was the Poor People's Campaign, where King was arguing for a bill of rights for the disadvantaged, and that America needed to pay billions of dollars to help Black people and the poor. That's what his last greatest project was scheduled to be. In April of 1968, the Poor People's Campaign, and he was arguing for an economic bill of rights for the disadvantaged. And the FBI made it very clear that he cannot be allowed to take thousands of people to Washington, D.C. to shut down the government. They claimed that it was going to be a bloodbath. You look at the news articles in late March and early April before he was assassinated on April 4th, J. Edgar Hoover, they set it up to assassinate King and to make him into an absolute, as they put it, a villain, because he's going to get a lot of people killed in Washington, D.C. The goal was to take over the government, no business as usual. There was not going to be any vehicular traffic, no foot traffic, and then tie up all the phone lines. And they had phases to, as they said, dislocate cities all over America. And King said this. He said this to the Black Power advocates, Stokely Carmichael and others, that they were meeting secretly in D.C. They thought it was secret. The FBI had it all wiretapped. He said, look, give us a few months. And if this program doesn't work, then you brothers can take over with any method you think will solve the problem in America. King said, I don't know if this will work. But in our situation here, I believe that nonviolence is the best approach. He never says that about being abroad, those struggles, because they were winnable struggles to kick out the oppressor. But at home, he says, you have nobody to kick out. Where are they going to go? So we have to find some way to interface with these folks. And this is what King's idea was. Nobody had the full solution anyway, but he did believe that give us one. And he said this, that the Poor People's Campaign, and he repeated this when he was organizing this, as he was traveling in late 67 and early 68, King constantly said that the Poor People's Campaign was, quote, the last desperate attempt for nonviolence, the last desperate attempt, because for him, that's it. If this doesn't work, then we have to look at another approach. And he was very clear about that. So that's happening as he is calling what's up in the U.S. You know what he called it? Domestic colonialism, to distinguish it from colonialism abroad. But he said that these are the same struggles. So Vietnam was very important, but we also have to broaden his international activity to Africa, because that influenced him even more. And we know that because of the records he kept were far more extensive and voluminous about the African decolonization struggle than even what was happening in Vietnam. So that's part of his international political legacy that has to be added to the record.
Good. I'll just wrap up with two points. It responds to some of the questions or comments being made. One is a comment by one viewer, Monique Mo Problematic. Jobs is subservient. That means most people in the United States are subservient, since most of them are on jobs. And I'm an economic developer, by the way. I have my own publishing company. I built housing. I do different things. And I'm the only nationalist that's good at doing this. The rest are into poverty mentalities. They think that being poor is next to being godlike. It's next to being hungry. Now, I'm not knocking our people for being hungry. That's imposed by the oppression of this system. So 97% of Black businesses are owned by one person, because they cannot get the financing to support those businesses from banks and stuff like that. And they finance the business through a job. And sometimes that job will finance the business. They can then leave the business, leave the job and maintain an independent business. I finance my businesses through jobs, you know what I mean? But I also, do that. But here's the key point. Poverty is the big problem. We got people going hungry in this country, a huge number of Black people and of others as well. And they either 20% of our people have no jobs. And the majority of people in this country now are working at low-paying jobs, doing 2 and 3. You need adequate, good-paying jobs. And this was something that King supported and even got it into Nixon's budget. It was pushed before Congress, and the Democrats opposed it. A guaranteed annual income. You need a guaranteed annual income that will boost people so that they can make an average of $80,000 a year. And guess what? It wouldn't take much money to do that. Are you opposed to that? I don't think so. And guess why they don't have it? The military-industrial complex eats up all the money. And then the congressman and everybody else that protects it. That's over $1 trillion military budget. $850 billion is going to the military to fight no enemy that's ever done anything to the United States. They've got to have a war all the time. You know what I mean? And if you stop that, that would provide the money. But even with that military-industrial complex, it just takes a small tax on the rich to see that everybody here has a roof over their head. I just got through writing a letter for one of my students in our school, African Children's Advanced Learning Center. She spoke at our Kwanzaa. I'm going to have her on the show one of these days. Brilliant. And, Manu heard her and saw her. Comes out of a family where the mother was facing homelessness. She had been in our school, African Children's Advanced Learning Center, and her mother's mother was homeless. Her father, her grandfather, was a drug addict, and her father was murdered through gun violence that's hit the Black community. And so what we have in the Black community right now is poverty, death, and all kinds of destruction going on. And this young lady who spoke at Kwanzaa, who looks like she's 25 and she's only 16, was talking about how adversity had made her strong. And what was the adversity? Poverty. On the verge of not having a roof over her head, not having enough to eat. You hear me? And she's nearly a straight A student. The only reason why she's not a complete straight A student, she's the second mother. She's taking care of an autistic child. This is the same thing that a lot of our people are facing. So don't tell me that an answer which will put because the majority of the people in this country have jobs. You hear me? And the question is, do they pay enough? And if they don't, then that should be supplemented. Nixon actually had this in his budget, which would have eliminated welfare, which Clinton did with nothing for the poor after that, and had some Negroes running around talking about they didn't like the poverty program anyway. Well, guess why? Because you didn't need one. But if you haven't got anything, then anything is better than nothing. You hear me? So my main concern in life has been the poor blacks and poor everybody else, but mainly poor blacks. And that's where I've addressed my stuff. So you can talk all this talk about poverty, job subservient. I'll bet you're doing one. And if you aren't, you wouldn't have time to be watching this show. I'm going to bet, unless you have your own business, which is good. And that's the second thing. We need businesses. You know what I mean? More of them. But the point is, we need capital for those businesses. And then we need to support them. We're the only ones that support black businesses, by the way. Every other group that sets up a business gets every other group to support them. You support Chinese restaurants. Mexicans get everybody's support. I was out last night, Ronnie Stewart's West Coast Blues Society at Everett Jones, which is a magnificent barbecue place. I've traveled all over the country. It's the best barbecue I've ever eaten. And everybody goes to that store, to that restaurant, but not too many people other than blacks support the average black business. And not enough of us do, but we're the only ones that do. But the key point is to have a business. You need to have some finance, and it's going to come out of your own pocket, a job. You know what I mean? So if you say it's subservient, I'm going to tell you something. There's a lot worse, and it doesn't have to be, because it depends on your attitude on a job, and it depends on what kind you have. So that's my thing there. The final thing: alliances and coalitions. There was a statement made, in basically that these haven't worked, that we've been subservient in them. Well, I could do a lot on this, and I'm just going to give you a little brief outline here. One, it's a distinction between coalitions and alliances. Coalitions are temporary arrangements to, build power, and alliances are long-term. You always don't know when a coalition can turn into an alliance. You're not always clear about what they are, but generally the alliance is with different groups achieving or organizing to achieve an objective that they couldn't achieve on their own over a long time. And that's the only thing that will keep them together, because alliances are problematic. They're difficult because people are coming in with different interests, but they will come in because they can't achieve what they want to achieve on their own. So I'll just give you 3 examples of successful alliances or coalitions. The greatest warrior in the world, Hannibal. Those were alliances. The nation of Carthage, their army was not made up of the nationals of their people, because theirs was a mercantile system. I study war. I've studied Hannibal in great detail. And so he had a cavalry that was second only to his infantry that he led, made up of another group of people other than his own. And the same thing with the people who made up his army. So on all battles that he faced on Roman soil, he was victorious, and he wiped out the Roman army at the Battle of Cannae. And had he moved on Rome and killed all the women and children, he would have had Rome. He didn't want to do that. That was his mistake. But whatever his shortcoming was, it didn't come from the fact that he was subservient in an alliance. And that was an alliance. They were in Rome for a long time. He was victorious at all times. So this is the first thing, so this is one example. I got a bunch of them, but I'll give you the second one. Black Lives Matter. How'd they get Trump out of the White House? And there's no celebration on this. they get put down because they're supposed to have stole some money, did they? No. I mean, if you know the history, you'd know what that is all about. But the key point is, it wasn't just them. It was a network of organizations in the leadership of which was blacks and the organizations of which were blacks, and then other groups, the coalitions that then fused and formed around the Breonna Taylor, George Floyd murder and other things, and then put up such a massive area of resistance. I'm proud of those young people, proud of them. You hear me? 50 states went into motion, 50 countries. You're going to tell me we were subservient in that? Bull. Study your history and get in the community. If you're not already building some power, talk with some reference points, which is experience. I don't know how much longer I'm going to do this show if all I get is people talking and no action, because that's really why I'm doing it. Reach younger people, but also people who are going to do some stuff on action. If you're doing some action, put it on the table, because we're going to have various things to give people support. So that's two examples. That is a big one. Trump and a second term, you don't know what kind of hell you'd be facing. And those of you who want to get academic and start saying, well, give me a definition of fascism. No, really? We were under it for nearly 300 years, a couple of 100 years. You don't know? Just go check your own experience. That's going to be worse. Then the third one I give is my own experience. San Francisco Freedom Movement. We basically achieved most of our objectives on our own, but those were alliances and coalitions in the Black community. One of the failures we have as organizers is often we just restrict ourselves to our own group. And sometimes we're not too respectful. And some of these groups, their behavior towards each other is all over the place. You know what I mean? And so even in an organization that's trying to do something on their own, if they're not handling it in a principled way, they got problems. But the key thing is alliances and coalitions, first in the Black community, and then secondly in the larger community. You can't have it in the larger community of Asians, Latinos, whites, Native Americans. You can't do that unless you've done it in your own community. And you got to bury egos. You can't have organizational conflicts. And that's what we did in the San Francisco Freedom Movement. And you had it in other movements as well. And so we didn't have any disagreements among groups. So when the FBI tried to come in on us, they didn't have any cracks to exploit. And then when we found issues that we needed broader support on, then we brought in others and they followed us and we radicalized them. So the San Francisco Freedom Movement, we brought in a group called the Ad Hoc Committee. It was led by a sister named Tracy Sims, 18 years old, San Francisco State student who had left school. She retired since as a public school teacher in New York. And then she brought in a coalition of the W.B. Du Bois clubs at UC Berkeley and students from San Francisco State. And that was a part of a broader coalition of the United Freedom Movement. It was a Black United Front made up of the major organizations in the San Francisco Freedom Movement. So our movement went from 300 to 10,000. And that was the last phase of the San Francisco Freedom Movement. But what did it do? We radicalized the white students in it, and it gave birth to the free speech movement. So if you've got insecurities about you can't run an alliance or coalition, that's your problem. But you have to have power. We had power. We had defeated almost the entire economic power structure. So, we bring in some students on the mop-up phase of the movement, the last three major job campaigns. We defeated the entire economic power structure of San Francisco, the Bay Area, parts of California. The only movement that did that. So those alliances, in this case, it was a coalition that worked to our advantage. The other is, I led the first campaign to take over the War on Poverty program. You think, oh, that ain't nothing. The War on Poverty program ain't nothing. Well, did you know that when Johnson set this poverty program up, and by the way, King listed this as one of the reasons that he was opposed to the war in Vietnam. Mainly it was vicious and violent, but it was also sapping the programs for the War on Poverty and other programs. He would oppose the war in Vietnam if it was not doing that, but that was his point. And so In the case of the war on poverty, Johnson made a decision when he set this poverty program up that he wanted community groups to run it. Now, most politicians wouldn't do that. And so he had a policy called maximum feasible participation, meaning that the poor would run it. So that meant in Chicago, Daley couldn't run it. In San Francisco, while they were running it, that policy set it up so you could change that. In Mississippi, they had Mississippi activists running that program in the beginning. You know what I mean? So I saw this program as a co-optation move because I never thought the war on poverty was going to eliminate poverty. But I saw it as a means by which the government would co-opt activists. So my decision was to take it over and co-opt it myself. And since we had power, we had defeated the entire economic power structure of the city, I then walked. I had a friend in Chinatown. I've told this in some previous shows, but a lot of you are new, haven't heard it. Guy named J.K. Choi. He had been a general in Chiang Kai-shek's army. You could say, well, he was backward, but he was a nice guy. He was a multimillionaire, owned a bank in Chinatown, and he was inspired by the National Freedom Movement, the San Francisco Freedom Movement. We formed a relationship. So I called him up. He's a multimillionaire. I said, hey, J.K. Choi, I'm organizing a group called Citizens United Against Poverty, and I'll give you 25%. You can put it into the community organizations in Chinatown. We have no say-so. Are you in? I'm in. And then I went to a guy named Gallegos because I was raised in the Bernal Heights. I went to school in the Mission, which is a Mexican area. I knew Mexican politics. I went to him and said the same thing. You in? You in? Well, guess what I controlled? 50%. I controlled the Hunters Point and I controlled the Fillmore. I walked in the mayor's office. He gave up the poverty program. And for 2 years or 3, we ran it. Funneled millions of dollars into the Black community, every penny of which went into block organizing, the only block organizing done in the country. And I put a brother named Will Essery in charge of that. I've told this before, but a lot of you don't know it. Will had been chair of San Francisco Core before, and he had the kind of orientation that made him suitable for chairing this kind of project because he was a draftsman. He thought sequentially, and I don't take any money from the system, And so we organized the only block by block, 45,000 Black people, block by block, through a coalition that got us the money. But once that money came in, we controlled the money for Blacks, 50%, 25% Latinos, 25% Chinese Americans. So I'm just talking from experience. And I've done a lot of these others as well, only when it was necessary. I couldn't take over the poverty program just with Blacks because maximum feasible participation meant you had to have the poor in it. And I wasn't opposed to that because in this case, it gave us more leverage and most of it in our behalf. So I'm saying if you think alliances and coalitions don't work, it's because you ain't been involved in the kind of battles where you can't win on your own. But you've got to be in charge of them. America's been running alliances and coalitions forever. And the people in it are being messed up. NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Trump's right. They need to end it. He's wrong. He's right for the wrong reason. Why? It's an alliance set up to control Europe. Trump doesn't know that. He ain't smart enough to have figured that one out. He just doesn't want to do it because it's putting money into foreign institutions because he's an American nationalist. You understand? But the point is that alliance is being controlled by the United States. And every time the United States does something, then the Germans may be doing it. The British will always be doing it. The Australians, and others, So your enemy uses alliances and coalitions, and you could say he doesn't have to, but actually it works to his benefit. And you need them. And then alliances and coalitions globally, those are important. You hear me? Globally. You hear me? Not only with Africans, there are others as well. Ho Chi Minh issued orders to his soldiers not to shoot Blacks in Vietnam because he had been here, had been radicalized by Garvey that led him to build his movement in Vietnam for independence. And, when the head of the army in Vietnam, the American head, figured out they weren't shooting at blacks, then they started painting their own soldiers black. That was an unintended alliance because Ho Chi Minh knew the hell that black people faced. He had been in this country and he had faced it from the French. So study your history, baby. You know what I mean? Huh? Study it. So this has been a nice discussion. There's a lot more you got up in here on the comments, but I think this is it. Any final thing you want to end this on?
I would just briefly say that it's pretty clear what King's position would be in terms of what's happening in Gaza, because he took those positions in the 60s. Number one, King would be against Genocide Joe in Washington, D.C., and Genocide Joe has never seen a war that he doesn't like. But it's not unusual for the U.S. to kill off civilians. They're pretty good at it, to just slaughter civilians, whether it's in World War II in Japan or whether it's in Iraq, to kill off hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians, to bomb, for the U.S. to bomb black people in Tulsa, to bomb them in Philadelphia. So the U.S. has been pretty consistent at killing people, and King would certainly condemn what Genocide Joe is helping to fund in Israel. He certainly would be against the Israeli genocide against the innocent Palestinian people and the madman Netanyahu, because he condemned the same thing that the spectacular savages were doing in South Africa. So that's one thing we should know unequivocally. King would be against the U.S. supported slaughter in Gaza. And clearly the effort is complete genocide. There's no question about that. But the U.S. is used to that, to kill off people. So that's all I really wanted to say in terms of his international focus, and his work has been pretty consistent. So that's one of the missing pieces that needed to be addressed and needs to be further understood, studied, and acted on, as you were saying a minute ago. It's to act on what King lays out as his last plans. He laid those out in his book. He laid those out in his ideas and plans. So enough with the dream, and on with the practical work of Dr. King.
Right on. Now, this has been a 2 hour and 48, probably 40 minute discussion. So I think it might be better if we put up the King Riverside speech next week, because that'll be nearly 4 hours. And I mean, I've been trying to cut this show down, but it's hard to do it. If you got depth, and I see the shows that are really good, they do the same thing. You know what I mean? You got depth. And Manu, you're a real jewel. I'm really proud of you.
Yes, sir.
Your work, your integrity. We're lucky to have you. You know what I mean? Black folks lucky to have talent like this, and we got some of it. And this is, for me, this is a young man. For some of you who are watching, he's your elder. You know what I mean? So I'm his elder, and he's young to me. And he's got a great family, your father, your mother, you know what I mean? And you're the outgrowth of that. So you have been privileged to a wonderful discussion from a brilliant Black man, Professor Manu Ampim. Proud of you, brother.
Thank you, Doc. I appreciate your consistency over the years. That's what the art of leadership is about. It's about being consistent over a consistent period of time.
One of my students called me a perpetual activist, and I had to kind of laugh because you needed a term for that. Would anybody say that you perpetually breathe? You know, but I get the point. And it's my most enjoyable thing is to be engaged in a process to help free Black minds, but to help free Black folks and everybody else. And that's my work. And that ain't no slave work. You know what I mean? That'll keep you going. And I know that's what keeps you up, working your butt off. You know what I mean? So Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Doc. And folks can find me online. They can also join me on the continent too. I'll be taking groups to Ethiopia and Kemet to be in the trenches. So thank you. I appreciate being a guest again as you continue to hold down the fort because we plan to win every battle.
Tell people what the address is for your site.
Yeah, it's advancingtheresearch.org. And you'll see my latest book, A History of African Civilizations, as well as a couple of articles I posted on my work on King, as well as the educational tours to Kemet. So at advancingtheresearch.org.
Yeah, and
Thank you, Doc. Yes, sir.
yeah, R. Thurston says your book, A History of African Civilization, revised second edition. Get that book. Yeah, and then donate to the show. Cash App sign Pan-African PUB. Make some donation because I've been paying for this show for 3 years. And I know some of you have tried to pay before, but we hadn't figured out this Cash App thing we have. So make your donation. And if you haven't, subscribe. And until next week, thank you, Brother Manu.
Okay, Brother Shock, I appreciate it. Thank you, brother.
Okay. Hotep.